Great. Hi, all. Thanks for joining today. And today is it's going to be a wonderful session by Ken Johnson and Seth Law, and they will be speaking on secure code review. I am so looking forward to learn from them tips and tricks on how to do code review. We had a discussion on our last podcast, which was about via committee, and then they were really kind enough to summarize their 2 day training, which is an exhaustive training at AppSec conferences across the globe. And they have given trainings in Australia, US, and at many places. They will have this training coming this month at AppSec Israel as well, Global AppSec Tel Aviv. And they have they will be actually giving a gist of it in 1 hour. If you have any questions, please drop it into the chat box. I will share it with them, or we will be sharing their contact details. If you have any questions after the webinar, you can reach out to them. So I would just give it over to Ken and Seth to take it over from me.
Awesome. So this is going to be a little different in that usually Seth and I are in the same room and we can like kind of look at each other and know who's going to take the next slide. So if we fumble around a little bit, that's probably why. And, as you said, this is a 2-day course that we've condensed into 1 hour. So we have basically Seth and I tried to strip it down to just the most important parts. And so we'll try and, get through that. There is a lot of material, so I think Seth, we should just roll right into it.
Yep. Let's just get into it. And yeah, if people have questions, pass them through Vendi on the YouTube live channel, or that'd be great. Otherwise, we'll jump into it. So this is Seth and Ken's Excellent Adventures in Code Review, specifically secure code review. Right? Ken and I have been doing application security for a number of years, and this is an area that we found was kind of lacking. That there was not a lot of discussion on in how someone approaches doing a code review. Not a specific like language, whether that's .NET or Java, but overall, what's the process that someone goes through in conducting a code review. Ken, I'm not sure which slides are next, so let's just go.
Cool. And I'm not sure so Vandy, do people see the slides only when I talk, or do they see the slides always on YouTube right now?
So right now they can see the slides, not you. They can see the slides, Seth, me, and Zoe.
So if Seth starts talking or someone else starts talking, does it come off of the PowerPoint slides? I'm sorry, I should ask this ahead of time.
I can control that. I can make sure that even if anybody else is talking, we will be on the slides.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Thank you. All right, Seth, we'll get right into it. So,
okay.
You can introduce yourself.
And this is quite obviously not me, right? This is our play on Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures, but this is Seth and Ken's Excellent Adventures. I'm Seth, at Seth Law on Twitter. I run a consulting firm, Redpoint Security. You can find me there if you have any questions about background or anything like that. But that's me. Find me on Twitter. That's probably the easiest place to get in touch with me. And then we'll go to Ken. Maybe. Ken, are you still there? You're muted.
Yeah, I am. Sorry, I'm trying to switch between too many things. So, all right. So I'm Ken, obviously. I work at GitHub. I'm an application security engineer. The only thing that's important to know about that is that I do a lot of code reviews. Seth and I both do a lot of code reviews. And so this course represents sort of our combined knowledge in doing those code reviews. So we are also, as Vandy had mentioned, we run a podcast, Absolute AppSec. So if you're interested in that stuff, come check it out. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about philosophy real quick, because I think that's important to it's very important to understand what you're going for when you do code reviews. So you'll notice the first bullet point there is you're not finding every bug imaginable. That's absolutely true. It's not even worthwhile, I would argue, and Seth would argue, to find every tiny bug that might exist. You're going for the most impactful things. So your goals when you're doing a code review are, You have to focus on what matters the most. So you basically create a risk profile for the application you're reviewing. You have to be as thorough as you obviously can, but you have time constraints, which we'll go into. So based off your time constraints, you want to be as comprehensive as possible. You want to hit the things that matter the most. And when you go to do your reports, obviously, in the larger course, we talk more about this. We're not going to get too much into, I don't think we'll be able to get into reporting at all in this time slot. But the basic gist is, if I had to summarize it all down, make sure when you give a report, your reproduction steps are very clear to developers. So it's very easy for them to replicate whatever it is you've found. And if you can, even give them fixes. Even a fixed recommendation with like kind of okay-ish code is better than nothing. So, and in this, everything's language agnostic. Sorry, Seth, do you want to?
No, that's what I was just going to say. Yeah. I mean, what I mentioned initially, like it's language agnostic. We're talking about the process. We're not talking about specific like cross-site scripting vulns in Node or React or anything like that. We're trying to take it a step higher than that. That's the philosophy of this course, that you can learn a repeatable process, that last bullet point, to actually find bugs and know what to start with. It took Ken and I a number of years to actually develop this for like the workflow that we use. And we kind of did it independently. We've worked at the same consulting firms in the past, but most of our code review was done, in different locations, in different ways. And so this is kind of a combined like framework that we use when we're performing these code reviews. So.
For sure. And yeah, obviously, like in the larger course, like we definitely do have, you'll see there's a couple examples in each framework and language. We cut out like the 6 different examples that we usually walk through down to like 1 or 2. And yeah, so there certainly are framework and language specific vulnerabilities and places they manifest. But again, if you have a sort of a methodology, you can find those things. And we've cut out, I've just sort of said today, we're just going to talk about, basically, you're going to get specific information about code reviews. Everything else in terms of our stories or interactive exercises, obviously, we can't do that in 1 hour. All right, so this is the crux. We decided to put this into what we call the Circle K framework. And obviously, like this is Seth and Ken's excellent adventures based off of Bill and Ted's excellent adventures. So if you're going to see a lot of corny jokes like this that are like outdated and old, so whatever, the Circle K framework, that's one of them. But, the 7 steps here, it's super important. This is what you'll always go back to if everything else fails and you just need to like go back to like, okay, what am I doing at a 10,000 foot view? So you're going to open a file, take notes. That's obvious. You have to get to know the application purpose. It doesn't matter. We talk so much over the course of 2 days and over the course of this hour, we talk so much about, all these nuances and, different techniques to take depending on your limitations. But the most important thing always, no matter what you do, it doesn't matter if you're just running a scanner and doing, that's all you're doing is like just running a scanner and analyzing the results. None of that matters if you don't understand the application that you're looking at. Sounds pretty simple, but we'll get a little bit more into that. Map the application. We're going to talk about that today. And then Seth mentioned it. Seth, you mentioned like, okay, we're in different locations, we're maybe doing like our own independent code reviews, but this is actually very much a thing you should do as a team. You should always grab, if you can, if you always want to grab somebody else and preferably more than one person if you can, and brainstorm the risks that this application could have. Seth and I can sit there and just like spitball, and Seth will come up with far different risks that he might be thinking about to look at for an application or a feature that's being added to an application. Doing this in a silo is actually like really going to hamper you because you're not going to be as creative as, combining another person's input or 2 other people's input.
Yeah, everyone's experience is different. That's the whole point, right? And everybody has seen different vulnerabilities, like especially in the application security space, or they've developed different applications. So they've got a different take on what the risks to that application is. They may or may not all be valid, or may or may not all be critical risks. But at the very least, you want to make sure that you're covering your bases, because if you don't, then you could be missing something that is critical that may end up being the vulnerability that gets exploited down the road.
Yep. Exactly. And then The other two are probably, I think, a little obvious, which it doesn't matter because we're going to go through that, building your list of review items. And then, obviously doing what you built, like reviewing what you said you were going to review. And the last part here is super important. We call it double back. And double back is using, after you've done everything, you always go back and double check your work. That I cannot stress that enough. I think we might have time for a story in here about that. So I'm going to go on to the next slide here. So we're going to talk a little bit about approach. So Seth, I guess usually you're the one who talks about this.
Yeah. Yep. That's fine. Right. So when it comes to doing a code review, there is, what is it? Smart Bear that runs like, they do all sorts of code reviews, not just secure code reviews, but they talk about like the process of performing a code review. I think their recommendation for a number of lines of code to review in 1 hour is something like 400 lines of code. As a consultant, somebody who does like security reviews, like no one is going to pay me to review, 500,000 lines of code at 400 lines an hour, right? They don't have the time, they don't have the money. That's not necessarily the best use of their money in finding security vulnerabilities. And so this is why we talk about the approach that we're taking here, right? If you can decide how much time you have to spend on a review, like Ken, where he works for GitHub, they look to the security guys to tell them, all right, for this security review, I think it's going to take us 3 weeks to get through this code and actually perform a decent coverage review. That's great. In my space as a consultant, I have a very time-boxed assessment period that I have to deal with, right? It's usually, hey, I might have a week or 2 weeks with a code base, but that includes everything from getting to know what the application does, what its purpose is, what all the different nuances are, and then performing the code review. But none of the types that we're dealing with here is just run a scanner and analyze the results. Those were kind of the first code reviews that we did probably 20 years ago, Ken, but nowadays it's a lot more manual. The middle ground that we want to set with this process is give you the tools to actually jump in and say, all right, I may only have a week or I only may have 2 days to review this code. What do I do? What is my best effort in 2 days that will actually give us some assurance that I've looked at things? That's the approach that we're going for. So no matter what amount of time that you have for an application code review or a secure code review, you can actually get through something and provide meaningful results. That's what, in my case, the client is paying for. In Ken's case, the business wants him to do is reduce that risk somehow. And to accomplish that, you've got to follow a process. It's very easy when you're jumping into code to start looking for SQL injection, right? It's very easy to go down the rabbit hole before you really understand the implications of what's going on with an application and whether or not that's something that you need to be concerned about. Both Ken and I have spun our wheels so many times with applications because it is distracting. We're developers by nature, and we want to jump in. We want to see what the code is. We want to see how authentication is implemented. We want to see what they're doing with encryption and all these other things, which is great. But if I don't follow a process, I'm probably going to miss other things that are important. And that's the approach that we want you to take out of this. Is that's the whole point. Is you need to take a step back and methodically go through it rather than just stabbing in the dark. And I think I covered probably more slides than this one, Ken, but that's the general approach that we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And even like to go back to Seth's point, even like so that nobody thinks that, I'm just sitting there with 3 weeks to like go find the most cool vulns, that are in some new feature that we're adding. The reality is like, no, the reality actually is that, and this is going to maybe surprise people. The reality is I'm actually looking for like the super obvious stuff. The obvious stuff like being, we don't want to introduce an obvious CSRF. We don't want to introduce an obvious, IDOR, insecure direct object reference. And separately, we actually are totally fine with like, if, through the bug bounty, there comes some super complex attack chain, that's just non-obvious. That's fine. That's good. That's why the bug bounty is there. So there is some limitation on time, right? There's some, again, figuring out what your expectations are for your code review. Nobody's perfect. You have to prioritize. So we add this because usually people are like at this point, like, oh, that's not what I was told. That's not what AppSec is about, but it's the reality. Like if you do this long enough, you'll find out this is the reality, but nobody talks about it.
No, nobody talks about it. Everybody talks about the time they found that super cool vulnerability, and they don't talk about the 99 other times where they just had to power through looking at .NET source code or Java source code where it was super boring, right? Or it was super intense, and it takes a lot of brain power. If you go outside the industry and you talk to people, and I'm like, oh well, I do. The best way to describe it is I'm a hacker, right? I look at code and I'm looking for vulnerabilities, and they're like, ooh, I'd like to sit in your office and watch what you do. And we're always like, no, you really don't want to do that. It's super boring, right?
But yeah, it's not like Mr. Robot or something. It's
no, it's
far less cool.
Yeah.
So the basic gist of what you're about to see is a mapping process. We've still got authentication and authorization review structured into this talk, or into this 1 hour, but I don't think we'll actually get to it. The most important thing is we understand your process for going through source to sink, to understanding the background, profiling an application and understanding its behavior. Those are basically the most important things. So that's what we're going to get into right now. We're not going to obviously teach you the OWASP top 10. We're not going to try and, cover every vulnerability that could exist in an application. We're not going to talk about, dynamic analysis. This really just is figuring out how to get a framework and methodology for reviewing apps.
Yeah, this is going to depend on your, like the rest of it's going to depend on your experience and what you know about code and what you learn as you move through it.
Yeah, the best way we can kind of describe it is it might take you 10 years to become the most proficient that you can become, or something like that, to understand all of these frameworks and understand all these nuances and understand that's a skill you can develop, but at least you need a starting point to go about getting started on reviews, and then you can customize this and change it however you want. That's kind of our philosophy here. All right, so we're talking about application overview and risk assessment, information gathering. Like I said, I don't think we'll have the authorization and authentication review. We'll have time for it, but we'll see how far we get. So this is like the non-technical aspect before we get into the pretty technical aspect. Basic just is give yourself adequate time for when we say that, we mean chunks. Like you want to work in a chunk of focused time. If you're constantly interrupted, you're not going to be able to review code effectively. So if that means you have to close down Slack or whatever, you should probably do that, because you don't want to go longer than maybe 2 to 3 hours in one focused chunk, but you should have that one focused chunk. It's just not realistic to expect you're going to be able to in 20 minutes, okay, I'm starting to get into the context of what I'm looking at. Okay, I'm going to go do something else and come back to it. It's just not realistic. So Seth talks about this, but it's really important. Just don't make it personal. So if you're like a blue teamer and you have some kind of relationship with the dev team that's maybe not so great, or maybe you're starting to get frustrated because you're not finding anything, just, step away from your emotions, take a break, come back to it. It'll be fine. Ask questions of the developers. This is one thing that Seth and I can't preach enough, is that you should be talking to your developers. You should not try to say oh, I'm just going to try and be so smart and not ask questions, which I've been guilty of, which is, you're like, oh, I'll just look through enough of the code and I'll just figure it out how this thing works. And, I'll make some assumptions. You don't. Yesterday, actually, I actually reached out to the dev team and was like, hey, I don't know if this is actually a finding. Was this intended? Turns out it wasn't. So I opened up an issue, but I could have sat there and beat my head against the wall for a couple hours and wasted everyone's time, or I could just ask and it took 5 minutes. That's what we're trying to say.
Yeah, the idea is that you want to short circuit how much time it's taking you to understand what the code is and to figure out if they are vulnerabilities or not. I mean, in a typical, white box or code review assessment, what we're looking for is, hey, everything's on the table. It's not just the code itself, but the developers are there. There's other architects and things or people that you can reach out to answer those questions. There's other documentation that you can dig into it. And if you don't understand, ask the expert, right? Stack Overflow is not the expert in this case, right? In most of the reviews that we do, And yes, you could probably take 2 weeks and figure it out on your own, but it is time boxed, right? You don't have that amount of time. It's better to reach out at any given point than it is to, spin your wheels and try to understand something that is a complex environment. And that's where
No, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. That's what I was going to say.
This is where it gets weird online, Seth. Is like, it's hard to.
That's fine. But this is where framework code documentation is your friend, along with the people that are out there, the resources that you have. Like that's why we spend so much time when we're looking at an application in profiling that application and figuring out what it's doing, because we want to know what documentation and resources exist for that specific language and framework. If I have that, I'm going to spend less time on Google when I'm doing my review than if I don't, and I run into a library or something like that I'm unfamiliar with. It's going to take me more time after the fact, and I'm going to end up having to redo my analysis section because of new information that I've found. So.
Yep. Yeah, and on that note, framework and code documentation. You're going to hear us reiterate this in the next section over and over again. Actually, usually when we do this course, it's reiterated the entire 2 days because that documentation can be very, very helpful. You'll see why. So we're not going to talk too much about this right now, but we will bring it up and then we'll address it later because we want to teach you the right way to do this. And then before we teach you like, hey, okay, well, then there's the reality and like, here's some shortcuts to this whole thing. So just real quick, people always have this question: what happens when I've got 2 million lines of code and I got like a week or whatever to review it? We'll talk more about it, but don't fret. Like, this still applies. There's certain parts that you will drop from the methodology, but at least what we're covering today, you won't. Like, you definitely need to still understand the behavior. That's the thing that we're about to talk about now, which is application overview and risk assessment. So you need to build an understanding of like what is the application, like what's its behavior, meaning like what's it there for, what's its business purpose. Is it just an API? Is a web front end with an API? These are some fairly obvious things, and we have like a checklist which we're going to show you that allows you to kind of go through and say, all right, this is what kind of behavior that we're looking for and talking about, that we're trying to identify. Same thing for technology stack and app archaeology. So when we get into behavior profiling, what we're asking, the main thing that we're asking is, what does it do? What's the business purpose? Who does it do it for? So this is important for understanding if this is like, is this just for internal employees? Does it have an external customer base? Does it have an administrative support aspect for internal employees with a customer-facing, external customer-facing sort of side to it? Like, these are important things to know because it's definitely going to impact like what risks exist, how the application roles are defined. So that's pretty basic information that you need to know about the application and what kind of information will it hold. One thing that we've started doing internally at GitHub is when a new application is being developed, we actually ask, or even a feature that relates to something like this, we'll actually start asking like, okay, what is the most sensitive information that this thing is going to have? How does it flow? What's your expectations? We do that before code's even written now, just so that we can kind of get everyone thinking about, okay, what stuff should we be concerned about? And then what are the different types of roles? User, admin, that kind of goes back to who does this do it for? And then what aspects concern and I think, Seth, you can talk to this, but you'd be surprised if you actually ask like project managers and developers, you'll get some pretty good information out of asking this question to them.
Yeah. And this is one thing that I learned probably within the first year of actually doing consulting in general, right? Is most of the time when you're talking to technical staff, they already know where the issues exist, right? I can't tell you the number of times that I've found some sort of vulnerability in an application. I'm thinking specifically of like a SQL injection vulnerability from doing in a code review. I go back to the developers and I'm like, hey guys, it looks like I found this. And they're like, hey, was that in this project? And I'm like, yes. And they're like, oh yeah, that's old code. We knew that it was there, right? And I'm like, dang it, if I had just asked that question up front about, hey, which of these code bases are you most concerned about in this microservice architecture, they would have pointed right at that one and said, well, this one hasn't been looked at for a while. And I could have short-circuited that whole, hey, moving through the code bit by bit, I could have bumped that up on the list because it was more concerning. And so asking that question becomes hypercritical. I know when we're scoping applications, as far as like the consulting side, that these are always kind of the questions that we ask, but we don't always have the right people in the room when we ask that. I mean, if you're talking to a compliance officer, they're going to have different concerns than the technical staff is. And so you always want to re-ask that question multiple times. Hey, what are you concerned about with this code? And make sure that each person in the room can actually address that.
Yep. As we get into the technology stack, this is where we talked about just a few slides back, we talked about like documentation being your friend. You're going to need to know what obviously what's the framework and language. And this is because there are certain risks that exist in, say, a Ruby and Rails app than might exist in a Golang app. There are different ways that there's different the documentation might, like, for instance, when we talk about routing, we'll kind of get into this. There might be concerns in one framework, just introducing vulnerabilities in just the straight up routing component of it. You need to know the nuances of that framework so that you understand what the risks are. So that's an obvious one, but what's maybe sometimes less obvious is like third-party components. So like, is it using some sort of like, for instance, Zora or Braintree or Stripe or something like that for billing? Is it using marketing widgets, which might impact your CSP that you're trying to, hopefully the application has CSP. But if one of your recommendations, like you don't have a CSP, you should definitely have one. Then you obviously need to know, like, hey, warning ahead, these are going to be some things that are impacted by that. Here's some alternative solutions to do them safely. Like you can't fully understand an application if you don't start looking at these things, like the JavaScript, the like other service to service auth calls it might be making. That kind of stuff. Yeah. So then we get to data. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. And what I wanted to address as we're digging through the technology stack is you're probably not going to be an expert on all of these frameworks, all the languages, everything that's being thrown at you every single time, right? Ken is definitely a Rails Ruby expert. I'm not, right? Like I've dabbled, but I'm not anywhere near the depth that he understands it. So I understand that Django Python stuff a lot better, or some of the, the Java frameworks. That's where I've spent more time. But with this approach, like what you're trying to get here out of the overview that we're doing is, all right, what is it that the application depends upon, and where can I go look, right? I'm gonna have to spend some time. It's a Rails Ruby application. It's on this version. Before I dig into the code, I'm probably gonna have to go spend some time in that documentation and on the internet looking up examples and how things are actually done, so that when I'm assessing the code, I can actually understand what's going on and am able to make some sort of a judgment call for it. And the same thing goes for those third-party components. If I know that there's specific libraries and widgets that are out there that I've never seen before, the first thing I'm going to do is actually going to go pull up the site that's associated with it, the GitHub, the GitHub repository, the issues list, and go look and see what it is that I'm dealing with before I actually see how the code itself has implemented it. And the same thing goes with the data store here. And Ken, you were going into that. Sorry about that.
No. That's actually, you bring up a really good point. Like even with Rails, there's vastly different security controls between versions, say 2, 3 to 5, which 5 is the latest, right? So like there's a huge difference between each of those versions, like say with mass assignment or CSRF protection or whatever. Like that's why you have to, even once you know the framework, you need to go in and find out like version specific information. And then data store is like pretty interesting, because think about it this way. If you're dealing with Postgres or MySQL, okay, maybe your concern is like SQL injection. If you're dealing with MongoDB, okay, that's a very different version of, it's what we call NoSQL injection that you might be looking at, right? It's a very different type of animal compared to Postgres or MySQL type SQL injection. And then if you're talking about Memcache or Redis or something like that, now you have to be concerned about, okay, are the keys that store values, are those user supplied. Like there's a different concern there. There's also a different concern when you start looking at like, all right, well, there's probably by default unencrypted traffic going from the application to Redis and Memcache, right? Just because of those technologies. But you won't know that if you don't write down like this information. You say, here's all the technologies it's using. What are my sort of risks there?
Yep.
Again, even if you're just running a scanner and analyzing the results, this is all super important. You need to know this information to make any context around what you're looking at. The results of that scanner, I mean. So looking at the documentation. Now, so this is something we're actually going to show you, which is if you typically look at an application and just look at its README, like most applications have a README, right? Just looking at that will give you hints on where else to look. It will typically talk about setup, and it will typically talk about what exactly it's doing. And those things alone can help you. And you can also look at things like unit tests. And unit tests are my favorite. And Seth and I talk about this because unit tests are amazing for understanding like just how the expectations are around how the application will behave, what endpoints are going to be hit, what kind of data is going to be sent to those endpoints. So unit tests are like a great way to kind of cheat the system and sort of get an idea of like how this application is actually going to, from like a granular level, take data and how it should react to taking that data. So it's good.
And then unit test as well is like, I mean, that's a good indication of what's important to that application, right? If you can't figure out from the overview where the important hits of an application are, look at the unit tests, because that's going to give you an idea of, hey, it looks like they're really concerned about authentication. They're really concerned about these portions of the application because that's what's being used, or that's what they're testing every time that they build it. There's nothing more disappointing to me as a developer or as a secure code reviewer is opening up that test file and having it be like, oh, Java 2+2 and true, right? Like there's only one like stubbed out test, because it means that they haven't put their time into it. But at the same time, that's a great place to look.
Yeah, and on the note of where it says the Git protocol allows you to do a little spelunking, you can do git log -p, or you can go just look at like the Git commit history, and like there are super interesting things that we've uncovered from that. Just like, oh, here's the security protection I'm trying to bake in, or here's based off this bug somebody reported, and you kind of get a history. You can sometimes it's fun just to kind of get like a little history of what all is from a security standpoint like been put into the application, or the things they've been dealing with. So it's interesting. And this is a unit test. I said we talk about it. So there's this Keystone application that Keystone.js application that we use in the course as sort of an example. And we show like going down to the unit tests and looking at some basic like login unit tests. And we can kind of see right here, like, okay, here's the expectation. We know now that there's an admin part to this application just by looking at this unit test. We know that it does a redirect. So you see the browser assert URL equals. And so we know there's like a redirect if you're not logged in. And we know like some basic information about this application just by like that there is an admin login, that there is this sort of behavior just by looking at this unit test. So super easy to sort of just go in there and start taking a look, and super helpful. From a note-taking perspective, we take a brief moment here to talk about this. You can download, and these slides, by the way, are available. Like we actually we'll put these condensed slides down into like a PDF, but we actually have the full course slides available. For us, it's like if you can just look at the slides and get everything out of it, then we're probably not putting together a good course. So we don't rely on like our slides being proprietary or anything like that, or these templates. You can totally go to this URL and grab the template. We totally don't care. You should use it, in fact. And it's an example template that you can use. Yeah. Yep, exactly what Seth said. You should customize it. But we're not going to go through everything here, but I think the most important thing the most important things that we want to talk about real quick is like if you open up a file and you start taking notes, you should put down the commit number that you assessed at. This is great for a couple of reasons. One, if you have to ever come back to this application, you can do like a git diff, or you can look at the difference in what's changed between commit numbers. It might be like some huge changes, and just like you might be like, all right, just forget it. I'm not even going to try it. But it might be a smaller changes. And then at that point, this really comes in handy. The other time this comes in handy is if you're ever curious, if something comes up, like, hey, was that in the code that I reviewed? And you can go back and say like, okay, what commit did was this bug introduced? Had I reviewed it? And it's kind of just a good, like, just to know historically, be able to say what you looked at. And then in terms of like notes from the review, if you go to that template, the things that we're most interested in are route mapping, threat modeling. This is the brainstorming risks that we talked about earlier, and the checklist of items that you've checked for based on your threat model. And as well as like any files that are super sensitive. I mean, it's not on this list right here, but if you have like, for instance, like our application has GraphQL files that may not be in the route at any points, like in the tracing of routes source to sink, but it certainly needs to be reviewed. So yeah, like that's definitely a place where you want to look at or add sensitive files that you need to look at. So again, route mapping, threat modeling, brainstorming risks, and going through that checklist. On the right, you can kind of see a little bit of what we're talking about. When we talk about routes, like these are, so, Seth talked about my little utopia. Yeah, sometimes I've got a week to review 20 routes. So I'll literally trace, like, here's GET request, POST request, whatever, to this route, which is handled in this controller. And I'm going to just go through the entire source to sink and check off each as I go through and make notes as I go through. And then the checklist of things might be like just brainstormed items there on the right, of things that were like, oh, hey, this is handling like a multi-flow something that's sensitive. So I need to make sure that like there isn't a way to skip between, say, point A and point D, meaning like skip payment for some item I'm going to check out with or something like that. So
yeah. And the checklist as well, like there's kind of the overarching ones that we talk about. I mean, Ken's already mentioned that we were going to talk about authorization and authentication, like the AAA stuff. We're always going to be concerned about security issues, right? So there's always kind of like a subset, or there's always a set of checklists that are going to be in that, and you can almost just remove them if it's not important to your application. But that's where the threat modeling comes into play. That's where knowing the application and what the risks are comes into play, right? Because I'm always going to be concerned if there is some sort of user authentication, I'm always going to be concerned about passwords and how they're being handled and where that's going. So I'm going to do a full authentication review, as we call it, or an authorization review to make sure that users are identified correctly and somebody can't jump sessions. But if it's some sort of like microservice where there is no authentication, then outside of passing a token in, that's probably not something that I'm as concerned about. So that's where it comes in, that we're building out this note taking and we're building out our checklist. It's going to change from app to app.
Yep. Now on this part, we usually have this exercise, but we're just going to go through we're just going to basically go right to so we typically in the class would have you do this exercise where you actually pull up the Keystone code base. And let me switch real quick to this VM that we usually provide. And I'm going to go in. And I'm just going to pull it up. So as this loads, what we're going to just take a look at real quick is what we talked about in the slides, which was like, you need to look at the tech stack, understand the business purpose, and basically anything else that might be interesting that you can sort of dig up. So, oh wait, am I sharing? Yeah, I'm sharing the VM, right? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So the first thing is we obviously need to know the tech stack. So let's just go, like we said, back to the README and just take a look. So by opening this up, and I'm going to, hopefully this works. Yes. So this is a little bit prettier of a view here. This is the markdown. So a couple of things right off the bat, they're pretty obvious. Node.js uses Express. So now we have to look at Express, what version of Express, which we can find in like the package.json. But we want to find out, obviously what version of Express, because we want to know like, how does it, like some earlier versions of Express had C surf protections that you could apply. They weren't done by default, but that you could apply using Express. And now that's been broken out into a C surf S or CSURF library. But again, these are things like you don't need to know. You just need to know like that it's Express, and then you can go do a little bit of digging and Googling and figuring out what Express is. And then Mongoose is the database, right? So now you have to start looking at NoSQL injection and maybe go Google for like Node.js, Express, Mongoose, NoSQL injection. Find out like are there any like OWASP tutorials or anything you can look at that actually talk about this and that you could use to figure out what might be of concern. And also, like, here's an interesting thing right away. Now we have to be concerned about React.js. So that's a new thing that we can add to our technology stack here. So just another thing to put on your list. And we also need to know, like, what is this for? Like, what does this even do, right? So we want to look through this README to find out, like, what is it? And we can see, again, going back to this first sentence, like it's a content management system. So going from like literally no knowledge of this application or what it is, you're just opening code. We already know like, okay, it's a CMS. It's built on Express. It's built on Mongoose. It's using React. It has React for an admin UI. So we know now there's an admin interface, obviously, for the CMS that we need to be concerned about. And we know that it serves both internal and external. So there's internal for the admins, like they can administer this CMS, and then externally for users, like they're going to view the content. And then we talk a little bit about documentation. And is there anything you want to add while I'm looking up the documentation component to this, Seth?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, realistically, what we're doing is you're moving through this, that we're starting to flush that out, and we're going to start identifying risks as well. So not only are we filling out the language framework portions and the app archaeology, but we're starting to identify, hey, there's certain risks that are associated with this, like admin credentials. We know that authentication is an issue. We know that sessions are going to be an issue, so authorization. We also know that NoSQL injection. So we've got input, output, input validation, output encoding, source to sink tracing that we're going to be doing. It's all just starting to flush it out, right? Like we've got targets for Node.js versions, like what it was built to, like what it's probably running under. That's going to be important to us, and we'll just start to document it. We can't emphasize enough how prolific your notes should be, right? Put anything and everything in there and use it as a place for you to actually just jot things down, because it's not all going to go to the person that's reviewing the results of the code review. You'll generate your finding based on those notes or any findings that you have, but those need to be so they just need to be comprehensive enough that you can go back and figure out what you were doing, as quickly as possible.
Cool. And because we're probably going to go a few minutes over here on the hour. Sorry in advance, but like I want to make sure I think we both want to make sure some important stuff gets covered, and it probably won't be covered in 15 minutes. So we'll go over for a few minutes, but like we'll try to keep it pretty condensed.
You can take your own time.
Oh, okay, cool, awesome. So going back to this documentation in the README, if you were to click on this, your browser would open. You would take a look at the documentation for Keystone. It also had in that README a link to its GitHub and GitHub issue tracker, and so you can go look at the sort of the activity and the churn there. When we talked about Git spelunking, that's kind of one of the things that you can add to that. When we look at the quick start piece here, you read a little bit about Yeoman, which is interesting because now we know that there are different templating languages, basically compiling HTML using a mixture of dynamic code that comes from the application and just like HTML that gets generated. There are several options for that. So now okay, well, as I'm reviewing this framework, like I need to be somewhat concerned with the different ways that maybe like XSS pops up in Nunjux or Pug or something along those lines. So it's definitely like if your company is going to be using this CMS, you have to know like, okay, well, which one of these templating languages are you going to choose? And now Now that you understand that, you're like, okay, cool. I know like the certain strings I'll need to search for where that are like obvious, sort of like raw HTML is going to be exposed or something like that. And then like just real briefly going back to here, you just looking at the code again, you can see that like there's this lib folder. And if you just go to the lib folder, you'll see there's a security folder and already like, oh, they've got CSRF files, they've got framework guard stuff. Like, you know, you can just do like 2 minutes of just really quickly going through this code and you can see that there are like maybe some interesting things and you can write that down. And that's how you get started on profiling an app.
Yeah. Yep, that's how you get started profiling the application. But the important thing right now is not to jump in and start doing deep dives. Right? It'd be really easy to look at csurf.js and be like, oh crap, well, let's see how they're actually implementing that. And let's see how they're doing it. But what that's going to do is take away from the purpose of the current step that we're in profiling the application. And we're probably going to lose sight of what we want to accomplish and the risks that are associated with it because we went too far down the CSRF route right now. Let's save that. And that's the idea, is like we want to list everything out that we want to check before we start actually checking it.
Yeah, and everything we just walked through, that's part of the like what we expect when we get to the you're get to know what the hopefully people that are taking our course aren't watching this because they're gonna have the answer, but whatever. Like this is what we are going to after the exercise is what we expect students to kind of have found. And if they haven't, that's cool. This is like it's a thought exercise. The one thing we don't necessarily see people always finding in that exercise is like, hey, there is that security folder, but there's also like this libsession.js file, which is pretty awesome because it literally details their entire authentication schema and how they handle sessions in one bit. We don't really have the time to talk about it today, but there are some interesting things in that file that like, yeah, you can. And by the way, all this code's open source, so you can go download it obviously at any time. But yeah, so information gathering. This is Seth just talked about it, but the most important thing is to always understand the app. So we're going to talk, we can't talk through all of the things that you see here, but we do want to cover before we get off here is creating sort of a map. And this is a source to sync map that we're talking about. So where does user content hit or user supplied information hit the application? And how is it processed throughout the application so that you can review the important bits along the way? So we're going to not cover, I think we just cover, we shut it down to cut it down to just Rails and Node.js for like mapping for this. I'm trying to think of what's important to cover here. I think everything is, but I want to go, let's tell them that, can you real briefly go into the response.redirect thing? Because maybe it'll hit home. Let me just give a little information on this real quick. When we talked about the framework nuance stuff, when we talked about like, okay, you need to understand like how routes get defined, where in a controller in action, like where data is being processed, what security controls are supposed to exist, such as like CSRF and authorization preventing like insecure direct object reference, all that stuff. Like, but there's an interesting case that Seth and I came about. Like we actually, in the middle of building this course, had this interesting story that like Seth was like, wait, you had that? And I'm like, wait, you had that? Here's what I found. So, yeah.
So, I mean, it was basically an application that like was reviewing both code review and dynamic, right? Which you want to have a running instance if you can when you're doing a code review. But what I was seeing was I'd hit the admin section of this page before I had authenticated, and like I would just get a redirect like you would expect. So login.aspx, right? A .NET application. But the issue was I was spidering the application, and I was noticing that there was all these responses coming back from different admin locations, all that were redirecting to login.aspx, but the response size was different every single time. And if I looked at the actual response that was coming back in the body, the admin page was being generated and sent back to me, even though the location headers in the response, we're sending the browser back to the login page. So effectively, I had admin privileges. All I had to do was change the HTTP response from a 302 redirect to a 200, and I could browse the admin page, and I could do that, automatically. And I was like, wow, this was really odd. Like, why did it actually happen? And this is what Ken and I were talking about is, hey, these are kind of like weird edge cases that I've seen before. So I bring this up, and Ken's like, hey, you know what? I've seen that before as well. And it has to do with a weird nuance with .NET. And, Ken, do you want to talk to that, or you want me to just keep going?
So the point of this is that when we're doing this flow and we're figuring out, like, here's the authorization functions that are expected to be placed on certain areas of the code where, our whatever request we're sending gets processed. Like, it may look like, okay, response.redirect. Okay, if they're not an admin, they're just getting redirected, so that's fine. But you actually have to look at the framework, and you have to look at, like, the documentation on, say, .redirect. And the reason is like, in this case, if you provided that little parameter there, you see false, what would happen is that it would short circuit the rest of the logic, meaning it would just, instead of saying, like, okay, I'm going to halt the rest of this request, and I'm not going to, like, allow the body of that HTML page to be, served up, and I'm not going to allow requests to continue. What that false says is, no, I'm going to allow that totally. Like, I'll send you a 301, but guess what? I'll show you the admin dashboard. I'll let you make changes to the admin dashboard. I'll let you just continue on, because I'm not going to halt the chain of execution of that code. You wouldn't know that if you didn't do those steps in the beginning, where you start to profile what you're looking at and start to, like, look at some of these important areas where authorization occurs, and then, like, what are the nuances you need to understand about .NET and redirect or something like that. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah. So in this information gathering phase, right, the first phase was we profiled the application. We kind of figured out what, hey, it's using .NET. In this phase, we're going to actually look at, hey, what is the authorization? What are the controls, the security controls that are used for different things in the application? So that we can dig into that further down the road. So in this case, if we were looking at a .NET application, we see these response redirects, and we see, like, a false or other tags in there. We're probably going to be like, hey, we're going to flag this and take a look at it later when we get to our, authentication review or our authorization review. But at least we're going to look at it and maybe catch that vulnerability before it actually gets released. So that's what the whole purpose of the information gathering phase is. It's basically that we are identifying those security functions that are built into the application that are doing different things and that we're depending upon, or that the application is depending upon.
And now we're going to go right into mapping. Mapping is the source to sink bit. So right here, we just want to give you, this is a generic application flow. So here you have /route, which is like, it could be like /dashboard or /home, whatever the HTTP path is. That's what that purple /route square denotes. So after that request hits the application and it's routed to wherever that logic's going to be processed, there is typically an authorization function that will be invoked. And now it might not be if it's like a place in the code that's sort of, it's an unauthenticated part of the application. Maybe no authorization occurs because nobody cares. But if there is any sort of, like, personalized, like, your account settings, or, maybe some site that you have to log into because you have to have an account with, and whatever, like, all that stuff that's authenticated, that requires you to be authenticated and have and be authorized, is going to undergo some authorization logic prior to that, or prior to that logic being processed. And when we talk about that logic being processed, it's very simple. If you're providing, like, 3 parameters to the application, then maybe some decisions are based off of those parameters, such as, like, I don't know, I want to buy a ticket to Tel Aviv, right? And I want to do it for these dates. Well, that information is going to be processed and it's going to go somewhere. It might be retrieving information from the data store to see what available flights exist on those dates. It might queue up a job to say, hey, we're going to put a price lock on, the fare that we're going to show you. It might send out emails. It might do whatever. Maybe webhooks are being sent, some service to service auth. And the thing that we don't show here is that also, like, there is an HTML view that's going to be rendered back to you that might, again, echo out some of the input that you provided. So this is the general source to sink flow that you see in most all applications. In Rails, an example of this would be config. Like Rails is very easy from a security standpoint in the sense that, from a security code review standpoint, in the sense that things are always where they're typically supposed to be, meaning routes are almost always under config/routes.rb. And filters for authorization are typically always before _action and before _filter. Like always. Like I'm saying typically, I'm adding these little caveats because I know one of these days somebody's going to say I have an example that's different, but I've never had an example that's different. I've reviewed a lot of these applications. It's always config routes.rb, always before action, before filter for authorization. And then for processing logs, it's you've got app controllers folder, and then everything that's like home_controller.rb, that's where all this stuff is processed at, and then your data store is under your models. And we're showing this just to give you some example of what this looks like. So I took a picture of something that's kind of important. If you get to know the application stack and you're able to install libraries, you're able to do things like this, which is really cool. You can run like this command, and you can do this. We show it with Django. We show it with a few other frameworks where you can actually run these commands that give you the routes and tell you where it's going. So to break this down, here you see we have this GET request to / forgot _ password. And now we know it's going to app /controllers / password _resets. And within that folder, that file, there's a method called forgot _ password that's defined. And now you know that you need to look at that specific area for where your logic's getting processed. And again, these slides will be open, So, or these slides will be available so you don't have to remember all of it. And if you cannot run rake routes, or you can't do this in one of the other applications you're looking at, or whatever framework, you can always look at the routing files. Every single application has a place where it defines, and I'm not talking about Rails, I'm talking about every application has a place where it defines an HTTP path and then where that logic's going to be processed. So that's pretty simple.
Yeah. So again, this goes back to the initial like app archaeology that we did, right? I know if I'm using struts, there's a specific way that different versions of struts actually defines routes, and that's what we're going to be using in this case. The one thing that I did want to bring up, most applications, right, that we look at, like from an open source perspective, there's usually a few routes that are in there. I have run into the applications where there are hundreds or thousands of routes, and I have to almost distill down those as well. I can't analyze 1,000 routes that are calling 500 to 600 different functions. I can't do that in a week, so I'm going to have to distill down again to what are the security routes that I'm concerned about. So every time that we're looking at this, like if we've got a massive amount of information that we're trying to analyze, we're going to hone in on those different security pieces, and that's what we're going to analyze. And we're just going to say, hey, it was a best effort. I was limited to 40 hours. I was limited to 80 hours, and so I can't cover everything. So this is what I did cover, and at least justify and have a process for that justification.
Yeah, and I'm going to skip ahead I'm going to skip ahead real quick to what you had talked about, which is like best effort. Like for Node.js and Express, one of the things I have to do is like often there's like a route. Basically, I show here 3 different, like it's app.get, app.post, app.delete. App is just a variable that gets called, but based off of the fact that like I've reviewed a lot of Express applications, and I think based off of like maybe the tutorials that are out there, or just the standard nomenclature developers use, it's almost always like app.get or route.get or whatever. Like the variables are usually like called app or route or something like that. But most often that's the 2 that you see, app and route. And so I know to search the entire code base, like first I need to find out like what's the nomenclature they're using in this application. Is it like route.get, route.post? Cool. If I do that, I'm just going to do a simple search for where that's defined. Like I'm literally just going to search the code base for app.get, for instance. And now I can start to see like, okay, under app /routes under, / index.js, like here's where all those routes are defined. Like, cool. I now know like there's shown here are what, 3 files. I know 3 files that actually have routes defined inside of them. So I know that's where I need to start looking for like, how like you can see here, I'm trying to show here, like you can see on this right here, you can see, and I know I'm going really fast. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to cram this all in a short period of time. But for instance, if you analyze one of these routes, I can see, okay, to the request / dashboard, there is this function called is logged in. That's the middleware that exists. That's the middleware that gets called prior to session handler .display welcome page. So in theory, if I review is logged in, then I should see some authorization function that does an attempt to say like, okay, you have a session cookie and I can identify you by that session cookie. And now that I know your identity and I know you're you're an authenticated user, hey, that's cool. You can totally go on and your whatever request you're sending, whatever kind of parameters are being sent in the request to / dashboard, that'll all get processed by that display welcome page function. So this is for me how I start to build my map. I can go back and let's go back real quick, and I can see like there is this is logged in function, and I don't see any other type of authorization function in any of these routes other than is logged in. However, maybe I would see some, maybe I'd see 2 or 3 different types of authorization functions that are going to be invoked. And I need to look at each one of those to understand what they're doing. So this is, again, building my sort of profile of the app.
Yep.
So, and like, you know, that's the HTTP verb, that's the path, that's the authorization function. And this is ultimately where your logic gets processed. So I'm kind of skipping ahead, Seth. I hope that sort of helps folks a little bit.
No, it does, because that's realistically the mapping section. So yeah, let's move to the.
Cool. Yeah. No. And before we do that, I did want to just real quickly mention something that was like when we talk about framework nuances, like it might seem like, okay, wherever the logic's getting processed, that's where the vulnerability is. But like in reality, with Rails specifically, like one of the things that's helpful when you know the framework, and like I talk about this, I think towards the end of this section, is when I was actually interviewing for GitHub, there was a vulnerability in the way that, so like you have to do an exercise to actually, you have to do a couple exercises to actually interview. That's part of the process. And one of those exercises had inside of it a routing vulnerability. And like going back to the Circle K framework, when we talk about doubling back, and when we talk about framework nuances, and we talk about even like a route being defined by Rails could be vulnerable, we're going to tie that all together in one place. So like when I doubled back, I was done with my assessment. I had a 3-hour time limit. I was just about at the end of it. I doubled back and I did one last source to sync just to make sure that everything was good. And I'm glad I did. I don't know if that was the difference between getting the position at GitHub or not, but what I can say is I found one additional vulnerability that was pretty important that was in the route. And had I not taken the time to double back, check the documentation on like, what is this route? Like funky looking route. What does that word mean? I've been dealing with Rails forever. I don't even know what that means. Like, I've never seen that. So then I look at the documentation. Cool. Like that's a vulnerability. I know why it's a vulnerability. And doubling back, knowing the framework, looking up documentation on the framework, and doing that source to sync, it all tied together to sort of have a pretty big impact on my success in that review. Sorry, going forward. We typically do an exercise here. I don't want to like get into it, but like really the only important part to notice here on the right is that you see a / /w*f /WTF plus symbol and bang. And you might be wondering like, that's really weird. What does that mean? That's a good question. The reason we show that, the reason we have it in this application that we have people review during their exercise is that when you, again, going back to framework nuances, if you actually look at Express and you look at its routing functions, and I actually have another story to add here that we don't have in the current course that came up over just the last 2 months of doing Node code reviews. But like, there are nuances in how you can use regex and you can use their funky patterns to create like dynamic routes that based off of user input might like, it could be 3 different ways that a user writes a route and it still be accepted based off of this like weird framework nuance. And another thing is depending on placement, which I did not know prior to the last couple of months, depending on the placement of how you use your routes and where they get defined before functions. Like again, I don't have an example I can show you. I will add it to the course that's upcoming, but in Tel Aviv. But yeah, like that actually was basically like authorization calls just weren't getting invoked because of some weird framework nuance that you really need to understand express documentation or read the express documentation to understand. All right, Seth, I don't know if we're going to have time to get into the rest of this stuff, if we just want to recap what we already talked about, since it was throwing a lot at people.
Yeah, let's circle back to maybe the Circle K framework, and let's talk about that a little bit. If we can jump back that far to it. Just as kind of a, overall, hey, this is what you got to do with a code review. I know we've been through a lot, and we spend a lot of time, talking about these different, talking about the different portions of the framework itself, right? But realistically, this is what we're going back to, right? Is you've got a process, you've got a file, and a standard that you're using in your code review. The first thing that you want to do is you've got to get to know the application purpose. You want to map out the application. And then we didn't really get to brainstorming the risks of the application, but we did address that a little bit as we're moving through the mapping of the application, figuring out what the routes and authorizations are. But that portion is really important, right? I like that. That's the whole point of doing a code review, is understanding what those risks are. And maybe at some point we can reprise this, or if you've got questions on how to go about that, feel free to reach out to us, because that builds that list of review items. I mentioned the checklist. I mentioned that we always talk about authentication, authorization, logging, the source to sync tracing, the input validation. There's, about 10 different things that are always in that list of items that we want to review for every application. And you may or may not pull it out of that list based on what the application does and its behavior and the app archaeology that you've done. But these are the things that we're always going to be looking at is, hey, how is a user identified? How is it determined what they can do? Are we storing the right information about that user as they move through things? Are we storing, sensitive data properly? Are we encrypting it properly? So there's always those things, and those are in the slides that we'll provide the link to. It's out on the GitHub repo for the course. Feel free to dig through it and ask us questions if you have questions on it. Ken and I are both more than happy to help out, making sure people understand that and using it. Take a look at the example template that we've got out there. Both Ken and I use that on a daily basis when we're starting application code reviews, because it has proven effective for us. So
yeah, and to add to that, our team at GitHub, we've actually taken that initial sort of checklist that we provided to all of you, the example template, and we actually built per language and framework. Like, we definitely have some specific things that we look for, and then which we're trying to build out for the is as freely available, just like open source checklists that we can give people. And I think we already started that, Seth, maybe with like Node or something like that. But anyways, something like that. And I think the next, we're going to have all the applications that we show in here, all those checklists. And I think there's like at least 1 or 2 available now. But anyways, so our team built based off of the technology stack, like path, like here's the exact things we would be looking for. But also, there's a difference for us of what we're concerned about when it comes to feature requests, new features. And then like new applications, because new features with our specific monolith, there are a lot of things we have to think about in terms of the different actor types, whether it's a GitHub app, an OAuth app, a user actor, whatever the case is. And also about like certain things that are very specific to us, like your email privacy, or your private repo activity, your project boards, things like that we want to keep all that info private. So all these concerns are specific to us. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, Seth pointed to that example template. Cool, totally do that. Also start building your own checklists internally that you can share with each other. And don't forget, always brainstorm with 1 or 2 other people when you're doing a review. Do not do it in a silo, and make sure you ask questions of developers. Anything else to add?
So basically do all the things and do it right. I don't know. It's kind of hard. I mean, it is a difficult process, and it's a manual process. It takes a lot of brain power, but use some of the tips and tricks that we've talked about to speed up what you're actually doing. Like, think about the things that are concerning to you before you jump into it. Don't dig into the review too much until you understand what the application does and how it does it. It's a lot better to understand that, because then when you check those items off the list, it's a lot easier to understand if there's a vulnerability or not. So realistically, that's it for now, but we will post the links. We'll share them with Vendi, so she's got it, and we'll throw them up on our Twitter profiles, obviously, or wherever else they need to go. But I think that doesn't cover it, but that's at least a taste of code reviews at this point. Yeah, Ken, anything else, or should we turn it back over to Vendi to tell us to keep going? I guess, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we could literally do this all day, but yeah, like let me stop screen. Well, I'm just trying to think if there's anything else to. Yeah, just go back to this and oh yeah, the one last thing we talked about, the 2 million lines of code. We have like a much larger expanded version of all this, where we go through like all the different kind of techniques you can use and the tooling and all that stuff. That's great, but ultimately, if you've only got like a week to review 2 million lines of code, what we would say is if there's only one thing that you can do, it's do the behavior profiling and technology stack and app archaeology. That's why I left these slides up. That you need to always do. If you don't understand the application's purpose, you don't understand its technology stack, you won't understand the results of any scanner. So that's like you can pretty much throw away everything else, right? If you had to, right. And just go right to that. So, all right, thank you. Yep.
So thank you so much, Ken and Seth. It was amazing. And I can see that Ken is replying to a lot of chat messages on YouTube. Now, there's one question that was asked in the beginning, that will you be sharing the slide deck?
Yep. Yes. Yeah, we actually already do. There's the full slide deck, and I can put the link in.
That'll be amazing.
This is for the full course. Because like I said, we're like, hey, if the slides give away our course, then we're not doing a very good course. So, or if you can get all of the course from just the slides, then we're not doing a great job. We're not concerned about. Plus, honestly, one thing we always tell the students is that we actually want them to go back and teach the other people in their company, like, to do this stuff. So it's best to not keep it proprietary. That way people can actually share this. Here, I'm going to give this link right now.
Yeah. Sure.
And I'll put in the link also to the template as well.
Sure.
And Seth, anything else that we should be posting a link to?
Yes. Your Twitter handle, so that they can reach out to you for more questions.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Yeah, it was fun building this course with Seth, because what we didn't talk about is, like, Seth actually was kind of like my mentor. Seth,
I'm to blame. That's what he's saying. So I think we might have lost Ken. Ken, are you still there?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Okay, we can now. You paused for a second.
Oh, no, I was like, I don't know if I told anyone this, but you're my mentor. You hired me at Fishnet Security. You taught me how to do, like, reporting. And so it's been fun to build this course with you, because, like, get to work with my mentor to, like, get some of his secrets.
Yeah, something like that, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
All right. So all the links are posted.
Yeah. Exactly. Yep. Sounds like Zoe. Yeah, Vandy's your mentor. So yeah, that's good. So cool. Yeah, well, reach out to us on Twitter if you've got any questions, or find me and Ken at OWASP Global OPSEC Tel Aviv, I guess, and yeah, we'll see everybody online. So.
Or we will do a YouTube live from there, from Tel Aviv.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, we should.
That'd be fun.
We'll be sitting in one room, and then we can talk about it.
Cool. Yeah, that'd be fun.
That'll be fun. Yeah, let me check if there are any more questions. I think most of the questions have been answered, and all are saying thank you so much. It was a wonderful session, really, really amazing.
Thanks.
Awesome
Yeah,
to hear.
hope it's useful. Yeah.
Yes,
The whole point.
absolutely. Yeah. So, so slides would be shared with all of you, and this particular session will always be there on the YouTube live. You can go back and review. Even I'm going to go back and review and revise a lot of tips and tricks. And if you have any questions, please reach out to Ken Johnson and Seth Law, and follow Absolute AppSec. Great.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining the session.